Employee parking is behind the loading dock, my daughter's fiancé said, sliding his car into the space marked executive. Guests use the front. He held out his keys as if I were already reaching for them. My daughter Claire gave a nervous laugh and studied the pavement. In less than an hour, Evan planned to introduce me to the senior team as the harmless older man who handled maintenance requests. If I corrected him, I could embarrass Claire. If I stayed quiet, he would make a decision that could cost 32 people their jobs. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 61 that spring, and I'd worked at Northstar Components for 28 years. Everyone saw me arrive before 7 in plain blue shirts, eat in the staff cafeteria, and carry a battered notebook through the production floor. My badge said Operations Support. That title was true but incomplete. I also owned 72% of the company through a holding firm whose name appeared only on formal records. Claire knew I had savings. She did not know Northstar was mine. I had not hidden the truth because I enjoyed testing people. 17 years earlier, my wife Lena became ill just as Northstar was fighting to survive. I moved from managing director into a quieter role so I could care for her and still stay close to the factory. I promoted my best engineer, Meera Patel, to chief executive. Public attention moved to her, exactly as it should have. After Lena died, I never found a good reason to reclaim a grand title. The work mattered more than the chair. Northstar had begun as one rented workshop with 14 employees and 3 machines bought from a closing plant. I was not the lone genius in that story. Meera solved production failures that I could barely describe. Lena kept our household steady during 2 years when my pay arrived late. The first management team accepted smaller salaries in exchange for ownership shares. When outside investors offered to buy control, I used nearly all my savings to keep the company independent. That history made me cautious about any plan that treated experienced people as disposable numbers. There was another reason. My father had owned a repair shop and announced his importance in every room. At home, every gift became a debt, and every disagreement became ingratitude. I promised myself that Claire would never have to perform affection for an inheritance. I paid for her education, helped with the deposit on her apartment, and told her only that careful saving had served me well. Silence protected our relationship, but it also left room for someone else to define me. Evan joined Northstar 8 months before that morning. He was 34, polished, quick with numbers, and newly appointed director of business development. Claire had met him at a charity dinner. He listened closely when important people spoke and looked past anyone wearing a name badge with a smaller title. At first, I called that ambition. Claire called it confidence. Meera called it something more careful. She said he understood the cost of everything except trust. The first slight was small enough to dismiss. At Claire's birthday dinner, Evan asked how many people reported to me. I said I worked across several teams and solved problems that did not fit neatly on an organization chart. He smiled and said, "So you are the company fixer?" I agreed. 2 minutes later, he asked the waiter whether he had a real career planned. Claire changed the subject. I watched the waiter's face and heard my father's voice hiding inside Evan's joke. A month later, Evan invited me to Northstar's annual family picnic as if he were opening a door I had never seen. He spent the afternoon escorting Claire through the executive tent. When a machinist named Luis Ortega stopped to thank me for helping redesign a safety guard, Evan interrupted him. He said support staff should route concerns through management. Luis glanced at me, then quietly walked away. I could have corrected Evan there. Instead, I told myself that Meera would coach him. Meera did more than coach him. She documented 2 complaints about the way he spoke to warehouse staff and required him to complete leadership training. Evan responded well in meetings. Outside them, he became harder to pin down. He never shouted. He used polished phrases like commercial reality and appropriate level. Each phrase told someone where he believed they belonged. His sales forecasts were strong, so several directors treated the behavior as a rough edge that success would smooth. Then Northstar lost a major contract worth nearly $4 million a year. We had capacity, skilled people, and 6 months of cash reserve, but the loss frightened the board. Evan arrived with a recovery plan. He proposed closing the evening shift, outsourcing final assembly, and removing 32 positions. On paper, the savings looked immediate. In practice, his plan would erase the team that could produce our newest medical sensor housing, the product most likely to replace the lost contract. Mercer sent the proposal to me because any workforce reduction above 20 roles required owner approval. I read every page at my kitchen table. Evan had counted wages as a burden but valued the new product at zero. He also assumed an overseas supplier could meet a tolerance it had already failed twice. I wrote 3 questions in my battered notebook. What happened to the launch schedule? Who owned the failed samples? Why had the evening supervisor's alternative never reached the board packet? The supervisor was Luis. He had built a cross-training plan that could move the evening team onto the new product in 12 weeks. It required $180,000 for tooling and certification. Evan's layoffs would appear to save more during the next quarter, but Northstar would lose far more after that. Mira asked Evan to include Luis's proposal. He called it an emotional appeal from an employee who could not see the whole business. That was the pressure behind Claire's visit. Evan wanted the board to approve his plan on Monday. On Friday, he invited Claire to tour the company and asked her to bring me. He said it would help me understand the demands of serious leadership. Claire was proud of him. She thought the invitation was generous, and I did not want to turn her happiness into a warning she was not ready to hear. I agreed to come as a guest. At reception, Evan clipped a green visitor badge to my shirt even though my own badge was in my pocket. He introduced Claire to the receptionist, Tasha, but not me. Then he asked Tasha to tell facilities that a light was flickering near conference room 3. Tasha looked from him to me. She had worked at Northstar for 11 years and knew exactly who I was. I gave her a small nod. She entered the request without correcting him. During the tour, Evan explained our factory to me with confident errors. He called the new machining cells underused. He described the evening team as temporary labor, although most had been with us for at least 6 years. He praised a loading system Luis had designed, then credited an outside consultant. Claire noticed my silence and squeezed my arm. She thought I felt out of place. In truth, I was measuring how much damage Evan's certainty could do if nobody challenged it. At the packaging station, a young technician named Naomi asked whether the proposed shift closure meant her apprenticeship would end. Evan told her no decision had been made, then added that flexible people always found opportunities. She thanked him because he was a director, and she believed gratitude was expected. After he moved on, I asked how far she was from qualification. She said 4 months. Northstar had already invested 18 months in her training. Evan's spreadsheet counted her only as a weekly wage. It did not count the skill we would lose the day she left. We passed Luis knew the quality lab. He stopped and said my revised guard had completed its 1,000-hour test without a failure. Evan's expression tightened. He asked why Luis was discussing technical work with a visitor. Luis replied, "Daniel knows this line better than anyone." Evan laughed and said every long-serving employee eventually believed that. The corridor went quiet. Claire whispered his name, but he was already walking toward the executive floor. I stayed behind long enough to ask Luis whether his cross-training figures were current. He said the certification estimate had dropped by $20,000 because the supplier had offered shared testing. He had sent the update twice. Neither message appeared in the board materials. When Evan returned, I closed my notebook. He asked whether Luis had been complaining about his schedule. I said we were discussing a safety test. That answer was true, but it was no longer the whole truth I was protecting. Lunch was served in the executive conference room. Mira was away meeting a customer, and Evan sat at the head of the table. He introduced Claire as his future wife and called me our unofficial maintenance historian. 2 vice presidents knew my identity. Their faces became very still. I steered the conversation toward the lost contract and asked what would happen to the sensor launch if the evening shift closed. Evan leaned back and smiled. "That is a board-level question, Daniel." "Then the board should have a clear answer," I said. He replied that people who had never carried a profit target often mistook loyalty for strategy. One vice president started to speak, but Evan raised a hand. He said the company needed leaders willing to make adult decisions, not employees protecting friends. Claire stared at him as if she had heard a crack in a wall she once trusted. I asked whether he had reviewed the failed supplier samples. Evan said technical detail was outside my role. Then he placed his keycard on the table and told me that access to the executive floor was a privilege. If I wanted to stay for the presentation, I needed to remember that I was there as his guest. Otherwise, I could wait downstairs with the other employees. He did not know that his proposed layoffs were already sitting in my notebook beneath 3 unanswered questions. Claire said, "You invited my father here. Do not speak to him like that." Evan's voice softened, but not his meaning. He told her she was being protective because she did not understand corporate pressure. Then he turned to me and said the sentence that ended my patience. You have had almost 30 years to become more than an employee. Maybe stop blaming management for where you landed. I felt anger, but it was not the clean anger of being insulted. I had chosen my title. The evening team had not chosen to have their work erased from a presentation. My silence had allowed Evan to confuse restraint with permission. Correcting him in front of Claire would satisfy my pride for a minute. Protecting the company required something quieter and more exact. I took off the visitor badge and placed it beside his keycard. I told him I would not remain for a presentation built on missing information. Then I asked the vice presidents to send every supporting document to Mira before 5. Evan laughed again. He said they did not take instructions from support staff. Neither vice president answered him. That silence was the first sign that the room had shifted, but he was too certain to notice. Claire followed me to the elevator. She apologized, then asked why senior executives had looked frightened when Evan insulted me. I told her they were not frightened of me. They were worried about the decision in front of them. She asked whether I knew more than I had said. I admitted that I did, but I would explain after the review. For once, my silence did not comfort her. It felt like another kind of betrayal. Back in my small office beside the production floor, I called Mira. We agreed on 3 steps. The board meeting would move from Monday to Wednesday. Luis would present his cross-training plan directly. An independent finance manager would compare both proposals using the same 18-month horizon. I also requested an audit of how staff submissions had been handled. I did not order Evan fired. A fair process had to examine his choices, not avenge my humiliation. Before making the calls, I walked the evening line from end to end. 32 jobs sounded neat in the board packet. On the floor, it meant Naomi's unfinished apprenticeship, a father who shared school pickups with the morning shift, and a quality inspector nearing her 20th year. I could not promise to preserve every position because markets did not obey promises. I could promise that a decision would include what those people knew, what retraining could achieve, and what the company would sacrifice by letting them go. At 4:40 that afternoon, Evan emailed the board. He claimed operational employees were resisting necessary change and that unnamed internal influence was delaying action. He copied Claire, perhaps to prove that he remained in control. 5 minutes later, Mira replied. She confirmed the revised meeting and listed the materials required from every sponsor. Her final line stated that Daniel Mercer, majority owner of Northstar Holdings, had requested the review under the company's governance rules. Claire called before I finished reading. She did not shout. That made the conversation harder. She asked whether I truly owned Northstar. I said I owned most of it and had since a management buyout 21 years earlier. She asked how many family dinners I had spent listening while Evan described my own company to me. I said too many. Then she asked why I had trusted strangers with the truth and not her. I told her about my father, the debts attached to his generosity, and my fear that money would bend our relationship. Claire listened, then said fear had bent it anyway. By hiding the scale of my life, I had denied her the chance to know me accurately. She was right. My secrecy had begun as protection and hardened into habit. I apologized without explaining it away. She said she needed time, but she would attend Wednesday's meeting only if she was invited as an observer, not used as a shield. The weekend brought a false calm. Evan sent me a carefully worded apology for any misunderstanding caused by an informal exchange. He did not mention Luis, the missing proposal, or the jobs at risk. An hour later, the audit team found that Luis's files had been moved into an appendix marked unverified. The finance data inside them had already been checked. Someone had changed the label the night before the board packet closed. The system log showed Evan had made the change. When Mira asked him about it on Monday, he said he was simplifying the packet. He argued that senior leaders filtered weak ideas every day. Mira reminded him that the proposal could affect 32 families and a product launch. Evan responded that leadership required confidence. Mira told him confidence was not authority to remove relevant evidence. On Wednesday morning, the boardroom held 9 people. Claire sat near the back. Luis had never presented to the board before, so I met him outside and asked what he needed. He said only 10 uninterrupted minutes. I promised he would have them. Evan arrived carrying a new slide deck and avoided looking at Claire. When he saw me take the chair beside Mira, he finally understood that the email had not been a symbolic warning. Mira opened the meeting and introduced each person by role. She saved me for last. Daniel founded the modern Northstar with our original management team, she said. He is the majority owner and chair of the holding company. He has chosen an operational title because he works where our systems meet our people. No one applauded. I had asked her not to turn the moment into theater. Evan's face lost color, but humiliation was not the purpose of the meeting. I said, "Your title does not make your facts stronger or weaker. Today, we will compare the facts." Luis presented first. His plan kept the evening shift, retrained 26 employees, and moved 6 into quality and maintenance openings. The revised tooling cost was $160,000. Certification would take 12 weeks. The finance manager projected that Northstar could begin shipping the new housing in month 4 and recover the investment before the end of the first year. Evan presented next. His plan saved payroll during the first 2 quarters, but outsourcing added freight, inspection, and rework. The independent review also assigned a cost to a delayed product launch. Over 18 months, his proposal was projected to cost the company $640,000 more than Luis's plan. The estimate was not a promise, but the difference was too large to ignore. More important, Evan had excluded the strongest alternative from the decision. When the board asked why, Evan said Luis lacked strategic experience. Luis answered that he had not asked to set strategy. He had offered operating evidence. Evan then said I had manipulated the process because he had offended me. That was the question I had expected. I opened my notebook and read the 3 questions I had written before the tour. Each one predated his insult in the conference room. The review was necessary before our personal conflict began. Claire spoke only once. She asked whether Evan would have apologized if he had never learned who I was. He looked toward me instead of answering her. That choice gave her the answer she needed. She removed her engagement ring and placed it in her bag, not on the table. She told him their private future would be discussed privately, but she would not marry someone who respected people only after learning their power. The board rejected the layoff plan unanimously. It approved the tooling budget in stages, with clear certification checkpoints. No job was guaranteed forever, and I refused to pretend ownership could erase business risk. But those 32 employees received a fair chance to prove the new line. Luis accepted a 6-month assignment leading the transition, with training support from engineering rather than an empty promotion. After the vote, I asked Naomi and 2 representatives from the evening team to join us. Mira explained the decision and the 12-week target. I told them approval was an opportunity, not a ceremonial rescue. The line still had to earn certification and orders. Naomi asked whether apprentices would be included in cross-training. Luis said they would, because a future built only around the most experienced workers would fail as soon as those workers retired. That answer reminded the board why the proposal deserved to be heard in the first place. Evan was placed on administrative leave while the document handling was reviewed. 1 week later, the board ended his employment for removing relevant material and breaching the trust required by his role. The decision was based on the record, not the way he had spoken to me. His sales results were real. So was the damage caused by treating inconvenient people as inconvenient facts. 3 months later, the sensor housing passed certification. The first order was smaller than we hoped, but large enough to keep the evening line busy. 6 months after that, the team had shipped more than 40,000 units with a lower defect rate than our outsourced trial. Lewis kept his leadership assignment. He also kept working the floor twice a week because, as he told me, spreadsheets did not make the machines quieter. Claire and I repaired our trust more slowly. She ended the engagement after several private conversations with Evan. I did not ask for details. I told her I would support her without rewarding the decision or punishing a different one. We began having breakfast every second Saturday. At first, she asked questions about Northstar. Later, she asked why I still drove the same 12-year-old car and why I always ordered the cheapest coffee. I answered honestly. Some habits came from caution. Some came from fear. Some were simply mine. I showed her the original buyout agreement and the photograph of the 12 managers who had risked their savings to keep Northstar open. I explained that my company was convenient language, not the whole truth. Hundreds of people had built its value. Ownership gave me responsibility and authority. It did not give me all the credit. I also changed my badge. It now says Founder and Operations Chair. The title still does not explain everything, but it no longer asks my colleagues to protect a secret that affects their work. I continue to arrive before 7 and eat in the cafeteria. I still carry the battered notebook. The difference is that Claire no longer has to guess whether I am hiding a life from her. Evan once believed I had failed to become more than an employee. He was wrong about the facts, but his mistake revealed one of mine. I had treated silence as humility, even after it stopped being honest. Quiet strength is not the same as disappearing. When 32 people needed the truth to enter the room, The most responsible thing I could do was finally let my name be heard.